He didn't know I understood Korean. When I heard what he said about me at dinner, when he agreed I was decorative, when he laughed along with men who called me irrelevant, something inside me went completely still. What happened next would cost him everything he thought he'd built. And I didn't raise my voice once. I sat across from my husband at Hanul Table, the city's most exclusive Korean fine dining restaurant, watching him charm 3 senior executives from Seoul with rehearsed phrases and borrowed confidence. Bradley Foster had been preparing for this night for months. I smiled politely, playing the role of the quiet, elegant wife he'd introduced me as, the woman who sat slightly to his left, speaking only when spoken to. But when Mr. Choi leaned toward the others and said in perfect Korean, "The wife seems decorative." Not someone who would notice if the ground shifted beneath her, my grip tightened on my wine glass. Bradley, my husband of 6 years, laughed and replied in broken Korean, "She's gentle. Doesn't involve herself in serious matters. That's why our marriage works." What happened next would shatter the 9-figure deal he thought was already his. Before we dive into this story, do me a favor. If you're listening to this right now, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when someone mistakes your silence for weakness. Stories like this remind us that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who see everything. And underestimating them? That's the fastest way to lose everything. Now, let's get into it. The private dining room at Hanul Table was a study in controlled elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering downtown skyline like a piece of living art. Soft recessed lighting cast a warm glow over the marble countertops and minimalist decor. The air carried the delicate scent of soy-glazed beef and sesame oil. Everything about the space whispered exclusivity, the kind of place where contracts were signed with a nod and empires were built over perfectly plated meals. I had been married to Bradley Foster for 6 years. 6 years of watching him present my ideas as his own in boardroom meetings. 6 years of standing beside him at corporate galas while he introduced me as my lovely wife, before immediately pivoting the conversation back to his achievements. 6 years of shrinking myself smaller and smaller until I wasn't sure there was anything left. Tonight was supposed to be his crowning moment. Foster Capital Advisors had been courting a Seoul-based investment firm for 9 months, pursuing a partnership worth over $200 million that would establish his boutique firm as a major player in international finance. Bradley had spent weeks preparing, hiring translators, studying Korean business etiquette, memorizing phrases he barely understood. He'd rehearsed his pitch so many times I could recite it in my sleep. What he didn't know was that I was born in Busan. My mother, Dr. Sarah Kim, had been a linguistics professor at Busan National University before she moved to the States and met my father. I'd spent the first 19 years of my life switching effortlessly between Korean and English, attending international schools where code switching wasn't just a skill, it was survival. I'd grown up reading Korean literature, speaking Korean at home, dreaming in a language that shaped how I saw the world. Before I married Bradley, I'd worked in corporate risk analysis for a multinational firm. I had a master's degree in international finance and a reputation for seeing problems before they became disasters. I'd never told Bradley about any of it. Not because I was hiding it, but because in 6 years of marriage, he'd never once asked. He'd never wondered why I kept Korean novels on my nightstand. Never questioned how I always knew which dishes to order when we visited Korean restaurants. Never noticed the way I stiffened when he mispronounced words or made sweeping generalizations about Asian business culture. When his Korean clients visited, he saw me as Bradley Foster's wife, the elegant woman with the mysterious smile who looked good in photos and stayed quiet during negotiations. He didn't see who I actually was. He saw what he needed me to be. Now, as I sat in this restaurant surrounded by men speaking my first language, I felt something crack inside the careful mask I'd been wearing. Not anger yet. Something colder. Clarity. Mr. Choi, the silver-haired CEO of the Seoul investment firm, sat at the head of the table with the stillness of a man who'd built his fortune on patience and precision. To his right sat 2 other senior partners, both impeccably dressed, both watching Bradley with expressions that were polite but unreadable. These were men who'd negotiated billion-dollar deals across 3 continents. They didn't miss anything. Bradley sat directly across from Mr. Choi, his charcoal Tom Ford suit perfectly tailored, his smile wide and confident. He'd been talking for 15 minutes straight, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to impress. "And that's why Foster Capital is the perfect partner for your firm," Bradley said, gesturing broadly. "We understand the Asian market. We respect your culture. We're not like these other American firms that try to impose Western frameworks on Eastern business models." He paused, waiting for his translator, a young woman from a temp agency, to relay the message. I caught the subtle errors immediately. She'd translated impose as suggest and frameworks as suggestions, completely softening the point Bradley was trying to make. Mr. Choi's expression remained perfectly neutral, but I saw the micro-adjustment in his posture. The slight tilt of his head. He'd noticed too. Bradley, oblivious, continued. "I've even been learning Korean to better serve your needs." He attempted a phrase, something that should have meant, "I'm honored by this opportunity," but instead came out closer to, "I'm honored by your bathroom facilities." The translator closed her eyes briefly. I felt heat rising in my chest. Not embarrassment. Something sharper. Mr. Choi responded in flawless English, his tone perfectly cordial. "That's very dedicated of you, Mr. Foster. Language learning requires great commitment." "It's worth it for a partnership of this magnitude," Bradley said, not realizing he'd just butchered their language. "Besides, my wife is half Korean, so I've got built-in cultural insight at home." He gestured toward me casually, as if I were a resource he owned rather than a person sitting 3 feet away. All eyes turned to me. I felt the weight of their assessment. The assumptions forming behind their courteous expressions. Bradley had introduced me at the beginning of the evening simply as, my wife, Elena, no mention of my background, my education, my expertise. Just, my wife, as if that were the only relevant fact about my existence. I smiled politely and said nothing. Not yet. Because what Bradley didn't understand, what he'd never bothered to learn, was that silence isn't the same as absence. And in a room full of people who assumed I didn't matter, I'd become the most dangerous person at the table. But to understand what happened next, to understand how a single dinner could dismantle 6 years of carefully constructed lies, you need to understand how I became the woman who disappeared into her own marriage. I met Bradley Foster at a corporate networking event in Manhattan 7 years ago. I was 28, working as a senior risk analyst at Meridian Global, wearing a navy sheath dress I'd bought specifically because it made me feel competent and invisible at the same time. Bradley was 32, running a small but promising capital advisory firm, wearing confidence like a second skin. He approached me at the bar with a question about emerging markets in Southeast Asia. Not a pickup line. A genuine question. And when I answered, citing specific data on currency volatility and regulatory frameworks, he looked at me like I'd just revealed something extraordinary. "You actually know what you're talking about," he said, laughing. "That's rare at these things." I should have caught the condescension hidden in the compliment. But I was tired of being the smartest person no one listened to in conference rooms. Bradley listened. Or at least, he seemed to. We dated for 8 months. He took me to the kinds of restaurants where menus didn't have prices. He called me at midnight to talk through investment strategies. He told me I was brilliant, that I challenged him, that being with me made him want to build something bigger than himself. When he proposed, he said, "I want a partner. Someone who sees the world the way I do." I said yes because I believed him. The first year of marriage was good. We were good. Bradley's firm was growing, and I was still working at Meridian, and we'd spend evenings talking through cases over takeout in our cramped apartment. He'd ask my opinion on client portfolios. I'd point out risks he hadn't considered. We felt like a team. But then Foster Capital landed its first major client, a mid-sized tech firm looking to expand internationally. Bradley came home electric with ambition, already planning the next 5 years. "This is it," he said, pacing our living room. "This is the moment everything changes. I need to focus completely. No distractions. I didn't realize I was about to become one of those distractions. What if I went part-time at Meridian? I suggested a few weeks later, trying to be supportive. Just while you're building momentum. I could help you more with the firm. Bradley's face lit up. You do that? Of course. We're partners, remember? Just temporarily, he assured me. Once things stabilize, you can go back full-time. Or maybe even come work with me officially. I gave my notice the following Monday. Temporary became 6 months. Then a year. Then permanent. At first, I told myself I was still contributing. I reviewed Bradley's contracts. I researched his clients. I caught errors in financial projections that could have cost him hundreds of thousands. But I did it quietly, over breakfast or late at night, feeding him insights he'd present as his own the next day. Just let me handle the client-facing part, he'd say. You know how these old-school finance guys are. They don't take women seriously in negotiations. Just let me handle the presentation. You've done all the real work. I'm just the messenger. Just let me handle it. The phrase became a refrain. A gentle hand on my shoulder. A reassuring smile. And somehow, I let him. I stopped mentioning that I'd done the analysis. Stopped correcting people when they assumed Bradley had come up with strategies I'd designed. Stopped taking up space in conversations about work that I'd once dominated. My mother called one Sunday, speaking Korean as she always did. Bradley walked past, barely glancing up from his laptop. Why don't you speak English on the phone, he said later, not quite a request. It's kind of alienating when I can't understand what's being said in my own home. My own home. Not ours. His. I started taking my mother's calls in the bedroom with the door closed. We moved into a bigger apartment in a better neighborhood. Bradley hired an interior designer who filled it with minimalist furniture and neutral colors. The designer asked what I wanted. Just let me handle it, Bradley said before I could answer. You're busy enough. I wasn't busy. I had nothing but time. The Korean novels I'd always kept on my nightstand migrated to a drawer, then to a box in the closet. Bradley never asked about them. Never asked why I sometimes murmured in Korean in my sleep. Never asked about Busan, about my mother's family, about the 18 years I'd lived in a language he didn't speak. He never asked because he didn't need to know. I was Elena Foster now. Bradley's wife. The woman in the elegant dresses at corporate events. The one who smiled in photos and stayed quiet during business dinners. Elena Kim, the woman who'd graduated summa cum laude with a degree in international finance, who'd turned down offers from 3 Fortune 500 companies, who'd built risk models that predicted market crashes. She disappeared a little more each year. I didn't even notice I was grieving her until she was already gone. The clink of wine being poured brought me back to Hanul table. The server moved around the table with practiced precision, filling glasses with an expensive Bordeaux Bradley had selected to impress his guests. Mr. Choi nodded politely. The other executives waited, their expressions carefully neutral. Bradley was still talking, his voice carrying that edge of forced casualness that meant he was nervous underneath the confidence. This partnership represents more than just capital investment, he was saying. It's about building bridges between American innovation and Asian market expertise. It's about... Mr. Choi raised his wine glass, cutting Bradley off mid-sentence with nothing but a gesture. A toast, he said in English, his accent refined, his tone unreadable. To new partnerships. And to understanding what we're truly building. The word understanding hung in the air like a test. Everyone lifted their glasses. I lifted mine, catching my reflection in the dark wine. For just a moment, I saw her, the woman I used to be. The one who knew her own worth. The one who'd forgotten how to speak up because someone had convinced her that silence was the same as support. Bradley smiled, oblivious, and drank deeply. The stakes were clear now. This wasn't just a $200 million deal. This was everything. His reputation. His firm. His future. And he had no idea how close he was to losing it all. Because the men across from us weren't stupid. They were watching. Assessing. Waiting to see if the man who claimed to understand their culture could even see the woman sitting right beside him. The toast settled into silence, and Bradley seized the moment like a man who couldn't stand empty air. As I was saying, he continued, setting his glass down with a confidence that bordered on carelessness, Foster Capital has consistently outperformed market expectations. Our portfolio has grown 340% in the last 3 years alone. I felt my stomach tighten. The number was inflated. It was closer to 290%, and that was only if you counted one particularly lucky biotech investment that had nothing to do with Bradley's strategy and everything to do with FDA approval timing. Mr. Choi's expression remained perfectly still, but I caught the micropause before he nodded. He knew. Of course he knew. Men like him didn't walk into $200 million partnerships without doing their homework. The young translator stumbled through Bradley's next sentence, turning market penetration strategy into something closer to market entry friendship. I watched her face flush as she realized her mistake, but Bradley didn't notice. He was too busy warming to his own narrative. We've developed proprietary algorithms that predict currency fluctuations with 89% accuracy, he said, leaning forward. No other firm in the United States can match that. Another exaggeration. The algorithm existed, but it had been my project at Meridian, refined over 2 years of testing. Bradley had the code because I'd given it to him. The accuracy rate was 76%, which was still impressive, but honesty apparently wasn't part of tonight's pitch. Across the table, one of the senior partners, a man who'd been introduced as Mr. Park, exchanged a glance with his colleague. It lasted less than a second, but I read it clearly, skepticism dressed in politeness. Very impressive, Mr. Choi said in English, his tone giving away nothing. And this algorithm, you developed it yourself? My team and I, Bradley said smoothly. I lead a group of exceptional analysts. Not a lie, technically. Just an omission. The team was one junior analyst he'd hired 6 months ago, and I was never mentioned because I'd never officially been an employee. Just a wife who happened to be useful. Bradley reached for his wine glass again, took a longer drink than the first. I could see him relaxing, mistaking their politeness for acceptance. He'd always had this quality, this ability to convince himself that what he wanted to be true was already fact. The beauty of this partnership, Bradley continued, his gestures growing broader, is that it's inevitable. Your firm needs access to emerging American tech markets. My firm has the expertise and the relationships. It's simple mathematics. Inevitable. The word landed like a stone. Mr. Park's eyebrow lifted a fraction of an inch. In the language of business negotiations, it might as well have been a shout. Mathematics is rarely simple when people are involved, Mr. Choi said mildly. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Foster? Of course, Bradley said, laughing like they were old friends. I just mean the fundamentals are sound. Everything else is just details. Just details. Like due diligence. Like risk assessment. Like the fact that Bradley had overstated his firm's assets by nearly 30% in the prospectus he'd sent them. I knew because I'd read it. I'd said nothing because by then, saying nothing had become my default setting. Mr. Choi picked up his chopsticks, studied them for a moment, then set them down with deliberate care. Tell me, Mr. Foster. What do you know about our company's recent expansion into Vietnam? Bradley blinked. I could see him trying to remember if Vietnam had been in the briefing materials. It hadn't. I'd checked. I know you've been making strategic moves in Southeast Asia, he said, recovering quickly. Smart diversification. And what would you advise, given the current political climate there? A test. A clear, obvious test. Bradley took another drink of wine. I'd say the key is to move quickly before the regulatory environment shifts. Strike while the iron is hot. Wrong answer. Vietnam's regulatory environment had just undergone major reforms specifically designed to attract foreign investment. Moving quickly without understanding the new framework would be disastrous. I felt my jaw tighten. I said nothing. Mr. Choi's gaze drifted to me for the first time since the toast. It was brief, maybe 3 seconds, but I felt the weight of it. He wasn't looking at Bradley's wife. He was looking at someone who knew the answer Bradley had just fumbled. Interesting perspective, Mr. Choi said, returning his attention to Bradley. Then, without shifting his tone, he turned to Mr. Park and spoke in Korean. He's not prepared. My chopsticks stilled over my plate. Mr. Park responded, also in Korean, his voice low and conversational. The numbers don't add up. I checked. They thought we couldn't understand. The translator was occupied with her phone, probably looking up business terms she'd missed earlier. Bradley was smiling, waiting for them to finish what he assumed was a private side conversation. Mr. Choi continued, his eyes on his plate. But his wife is interesting. My heart kicked against my ribs. How so? She seems to understand us. The way she looks. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Bradley, oblivious, jumped back into the conversation. I'm glad we're all on the same page. This partnership is going to be groundbreaking. I can feel it. The translator, flustered, tried to render his enthusiasm into Korean but ended up saying something closer to, this partnership will break the ground, which wasn't quite the same thing. Mr. Choi smiled politely. Set down his chopsticks. And then, deliberately, slowly, turned his gaze to me again. This time, he held it. Mrs. Foster, he said in perfect English. You've been very quiet this evening. Tell me, what do you think of your husband's proposal? The table went still. Bradley's smile froze. Oh, Elena doesn't really involve herself in the business side of things. She's just here for support. I see, Mr. Choi said. But he was still looking at me, and I could see the question behind his eyes. The test behind the test. He leaned back slightly, then spoke again, this time in Korean, his voice casual, as if he were simply making an observation to his colleagues. If she understands, now is when we'll know. The room waited. And I sat there, silent, feeling the full weight of 6 years of disappearing pressing down on my shoulders. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. 4. 5. Then Mr. Park leaned toward Mr. Choi and spoke in Korean, his voice low enough that he clearly believed it was private. This deal is risky. I know. Mr. Park continued, his tone measured and analytical. His confidence has no foundation. The numbers are inflated, and he doesn't understand our market. I kept my eyes on my plate, my breathing steady, my face composed. Years of making myself invisible had taught me how to hide in plain sight. The third executive said quietly. But refusing might seem rude. Mr. Choi shook his head slightly. Foolishness is worse than rudeness. Bradley was watching them with a patient smile, probably thinking their Korean conversation was a good sign. Men bonding in their native language. Cultural connection. He took another sip of wine, his third glass, his confidence growing with each drink. Mr. Park glanced at me, then back to Mr. Choi. And his wife? Mr. Choi's eyes drifted toward me again, assessing. She seems decorative. Beautiful but passive. The word hit me like a physical blow. Decorative. Ornamental. Something to be displayed, not heard. I felt my fingers tighten around my chopsticks. Mr. Park added. She doesn't seem like she would notice anything. The third executive agreed. She probably doesn't even care. They were talking about me like I was a piece of furniture. Like I was part of the restaurant's decor, present but irrelevant, decorative but disposable. And then Bradley, my husband, the man who'd promised to be my partner, laughed. He'd caught a word or two, enough to sense they were making some kind of observation. He leaned forward, eager to connect, and responded in his broken, mangled Korean. He struggled for words, then cobbled together a sentence that came out roughly as, she is gentle wife. No business mind. Good for, home harmony. My vision tunneled. I heard the words, understood them perfectly, felt them land in my chest like stones dropping into deep water. He'd just agreed with them. He just confirmed, in halting, barely coherent Korean, that I was decorative. That I had no business mind. That my value was in being gentle, quiet, in staying home and maintaining harmony. Bradley smiled, pleased with himself for engaging in their language. That's why marriage works, he added in English, gesturing between us. She supports, I lead. Simple. Mr. Choi's expression remained neutral, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not approval. Something closer to distaste. I see, he said quietly in English. The table returned to their meal. Conversation shifted to neutral topics, the weather, the restaurant, Atlanta's skyline. But I heard none of it. I was somewhere else entirely. I was 28 again, in that navy dress, brilliant and visible and whole. I was presenting risk analysis to a room full of executives who leaned forward to hear me speak. I was my mother's daughter, reading Korean poetry by lamplight, fluent in 2 languages, belonging to 2 worlds. I was the woman who'd walked away from Fortune 500 offers because someone convinced her that shrinking was the same as partnership. I watched her disappear, year by year, conversation by conversation, compromise by compromise, until she became exactly what these men saw, decorative, passive, irrelevant. And the man who'd promised to build something with me had just told a table full of strangers that I was nothing. Not even in a moment of cruelty. In a moment of casual agreement. Because he believed it. My chopsticks clicked against the edge of my plate as I set them down. The sound was small, but in the careful quiet of the private dining room, it carried. I reached for my wine glass, not to drink, but to give my hands something to do. To keep them from shaking. To keep them from reaching across the table and... I took a breath. Then another. Bradley was still talking, something about quarterly projections and market penetration. His voice sounded far away, like I was hearing him through water. Mr. Choi was watching me again. I felt his gaze like pressure against my skin. He knew. Somehow, he knew I'd understood every word. The question was what I was going to do about it. 6 years of silence pressed down on me. 6 years of swallowing corrections, of offering insights that became Bradley's ideas, of translating my expertise into language he could present as his own. 6 years of making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. 6 years of being called gentle when what they meant was weak. 6 years of being decoration. I thought about my mother, who'd taught linguistics at a university, who'd never softened her intelligence for anyone. I thought about the 19-year-old girl who'd moved to America with 2 suitcases and 3 languages, fearless and sharp and entirely herself. I thought about the woman I'd been before I became Bradley Foster's wife. And I thought about the woman these men saw when they looked at me, beautiful, passive, irrelevant. Someone who wouldn't notice. Someone who wouldn't care. They were wrong. Bradley was wrong. And I was done being silent. I set my wine glass down with the same careful precision Mr. Choi had used with his chopsticks earlier. A deliberate gesture. A decision made solid. Mr. Choi's eyes met mine across the table. I held his gaze. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the room, in me. Something that had been compressed for 6 years suddenly had space to expand. Something that had been holding its breath finally exhaled. I was going to speak. And when I did, everything was going to change. I waited until Bradley finished his sentence. Until he'd taken another sip of wine, relaxed back into his chair with that satisfied smile of a man who believed he'd already won. Then I spoke. Excuse me. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. The translator's head snapped up. Mr. Park's chopstick stopped halfway to his mouth. The third executive's eyes widened fractionally. Mr. Choi went completely still. Bradley turned to me, confusion flickering across his face. Elena? I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Mr. Choi and continued in flawless Korean, my Busan accent softened by years abroad but unmistakably native. I understood your conversation. And I believe there's been a misunderstanding about what my husband just said. The room didn't just go quiet. It went silent in a way that made the air feel thinner. Mr. Choi began, then paused, recalibrating everything. Do you speak Korean? The formality in his question had shifted. He wasn't asking a decorative wife anymore. He was addressing an equal. I said simply. Yes, I was born in Busan. Korean is my first language. Bradley's smile had frozen into something brittle. Wait, what's happening? Elena, what are you? One moment, I said to him in English, my tone polite but firm. The same tone he'd used on me 1,000 times when he needed me to wait, to be patient, to let him handle things. I turned back to the investors and continued in Korean. My husband doesn't speak Korean well. What he just said isn't what he intended. It was a kindness I wasn't sure he deserved. But I wasn't doing this for cruelty. I was doing it for clarity. Mr. Park leaned forward slightly, his entire demeanor changed. Where in Busan? Houndigu. My father was a U.S. military doctor, and my mother taught linguistics at Busan National University. The third executive's expression shifted from shock to something like respect. These weren't just fluent sentences. I was speaking with the natural rhythm of someone who'd grown up in the language, who'd learned it from family, not textbooks. Mr. Choi set down his chopsticks with deliberate care. When he spoke again, his Korean shifted into a more casual register, testing me. Then you know the difference between gimbap and kimbap? It was a dialect test, subtle but pointed. A question only someone who truly understood Korean culture would navigate correctly. I smiled. Of course. Busan people say, Jim, not Gi. It's something Seoul people get confused about. Mr. Choi's lips quirked, not quite a smile, but close. You really are from Busan. Bradley's voice cut through, sharp with confusion and something that might have been panic. Okay, someone want to tell me what's going on? Elena, since when do you speak Korean? I turned to him, switching to English. My voice was calm, almost gentle. Since I was born, Bradley. I tried to tell you once, early on. You said it wasn't relevant to our life together. I never. He stopped, his face paling as he tried to remember. As he realized he couldn't remember because he'd never listened. The translator looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Mr. Park was watching me with undisguised interest. The third executive had shifted his entire body orientation toward me, away from Bradley. Mr. Choi spoke again, this time in English, his tone measured. Mrs. Foster. You said there was a misunderstanding. Perhaps you could clarify. This was the moment. The edge of the cliff. I could step back, smooth things over, let Bradley save face. I could return to being decorative, passive, irrelevant. Or I could step forward. My husband's Korean is limited, I said, keeping my voice professional, addressing all of them. When he responded to your earlier conversation, he was trying to engage respectfully, but the words came out wrong. He didn't understand what he was agreeing to. It was still a kindness. Still giving him an exit. Mr. Choi nodded slowly. And what did we say, Mrs. Foster? In that earlier conversation? The question was a test too. He wanted to know if I'd admit I'd been listening. If I'd been understanding all along. You expressed concerns about the deal, I said in English, then switched to Korean for precision. You said the numbers were inflated and that my husband doesn't understand the market. Bradley's wine glass hit the table harder than he'd intended. Elena, what the hell? And, I continued calmly, still in Korean, meeting Mr. Choi's eyes. You also spoke about me. That I seemed decorative, passive, that I wouldn't notice anything. The silence that followed was absolute. I said quietly. You were wrong. Then I switched back to English, my tone shifting from personal to professional. I have a master's degree in international finance from Emory University. Before I married Bradley, I worked as a senior risk analyst at Meridian Global. I specialized in emerging market assessment and regulatory compliance. Mr. Park's eyebrows rose. Meridian Global? Yes. I left when we married. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The Vietnam expansion you mentioned earlier, I continued, addressing Mr. Choi. The regulatory reforms that passed last quarter actually create a more stable investment environment, not a riskier one. Moving quickly without understanding the new framework would be the real risk. What you need is measured entry with local partnership structures that comply with the new foreign ownership limits. I listed them. Calmly. Precisely. In detail. Mr. Choi's expression had transformed completely. He was leaning forward now, listening with the full attention of someone who just discovered unexpected value. The 340% growth Bradley mentioned, I added, my voice steady, is closer to 290%. The algorithm he referenced, I developed it during my time at Meridian. It's effective, but the accuracy rate is 76%, not 89%. Bradley made a strangled sound. Elena, stop. The truth matters in partnerships, I said, looking at him directly. You taught me that. You just didn't think it applied when the truth was inconvenient. I turned back to the investors. Mr. Choi was studying me like I was a puzzle he'd just solved. Mrs. Foster, he said slowly, deliberately. Perhaps you should be the one explaining this partnership to us. And just like that, the room tilted. Everyone was looking at me now. Not at Bradley. Not at the man who'd spent months preparing for this moment. At me. The woman who was supposed to be decorative. The weight of their attention settled on me like a mantle I'd forgotten I knew how to wear. Bradley's hand shot across the table toward mine, not to hold it, but to stop me. Elena, we should discuss this privately. I think transparency is more appropriate, I said, moving my hand to my lap. My voice was still calm, still measured. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been hot and quick and satisfying. This was colder. Clearer. Especially given the scale of investment you're considering. Mr. Choi gestured slightly with one hand. Continue. I took a breath and began. Foster Capital's portfolio performance has been solid, I said, keeping my tone analytical, professional. But the prospectus you received overstates several key metrics. The asset base is inflated by approximately 28% because it includes projected acquisitions that haven't closed. 3 of the listed client relationships are preliminary discussions, not confirmed contracts. Elena, for God's sake, Bradley's voice was rising. Mr. Park held up one hand, silencing him without a word. His eyes never left my face. Continue, Mrs. Foster. The currency prediction algorithm is real and functional, I said. But it requires significant manual oversight. The 89% accuracy rate assumes optimal market conditions and doesn't account for black swan events or political disruption, which makes it unreliable for the kind of long-term strategic planning you'd need for a partnership of this scale. I could feel Bradley vibrating with barely contained panic beside me, but I didn't look at him. If I looked at him, I might stop. And I was done stopping. The firm's operational structure is lean, which Bradley presents as efficient. But it's actually understaffed for the expansion he's proposing. Taking on a partnership of this magnitude would require hiring at least 8 senior analysts and completely rebuilding the compliance infrastructure. Those costs aren't factored into the financial projections. Mr. Choi's fingers were steepled in front of his face, his expression unreadable. And you know this because? Because I've been reviewing every contract, every projection, every client proposal for the last 6 years, I said simply. Unofficially. Without credit. But I know every number in that prospectus because I'm the one who helped generate them. The translator had given up pretending to work. She was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. This is completely inappropriate, Bradley tried again, his voice cracking slightly. Is it? I turned to him, and my tone remained professional, almost kind. It was the kindness that made it devastating. Is it inappropriate to tell the truth? Or is it just inconvenient? His face had gone red, then white. You're sabotaging me. No, I said quietly. I'm saving them from making a bad investment. There's a difference. I looked back at Mr. Choi. Foster Capital isn't a bad firm. But it's not ready for what Bradley is promising you. Not yet. Maybe not for another 2 years, with the right strategic hires and infrastructure development. But right now? This partnership would be built on optimism and overconfidence, not solid foundation. And you'd discover that 6 months in, when the cracks started showing. Mr. Park leaned back in his chair, exchanging a long look with Mr. Choi. An entire conversation happened in that glance. You paint a rather damning picture of your husband's company, the third executive said, speaking in English for the first time all evening. His accent was slight, his tone curious rather than accusatory. I paint an accurate picture, I corrected gently. There's nothing wrong with being a mid-sized firm with growth potential. There's everything wrong with pretending to be something you're not. That's where partnerships fail. That's where trust breaks down. Jesus Christ, Elena. Bradley's voice was raw now, stripped of its earlier confidence. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Yes, I said, finally looking at him fully. I've told the truth. Something I should have done years ago. For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, confusion, betrayal, the dawning realization that he'd never actually known who I was. That the woman he'd married, the woman he'd reduced to decoration, had been someone entirely different all along. Mr. Choi set both hands flat on the table. The gesture was final. Mr. Foster, he said, his English clear and precise. I appreciate the time you've invested in pursuing this partnership. Bradley's expression shifted toward hope. Thank you, But we will not be moving forward. The hope died instantly. This isn't about your wife's revelations, Mr. Choi continued, though we all knew it absolutely was. It's about integrity. Due diligence revealed some of these discrepancies already. We were prepared to discuss them. But the way this evening has unfolded tells us something more important than numbers. He stood. The other executives followed immediately, their movements synchronized. It tells us that you don't value honesty. Not with us, and not with the people closest to you. Mr. Choi's gaze moved to me. Mrs. Foster, your candor is appreciated. In other circumstances, I think we would have enjoyed working with you. He bowed. Not the shallow nod Bradley had attempted earlier, but a proper bow, respect given to an equal. The other executives bowed as well. To me. Not to Bradley. Wait, Bradley was on his feet now, his chair scraping loud against the floor. Wait, we can discuss this. Elena doesn't understand the full context. She's been out of the business world for years, she doesn't. She understands perfectly, Mr. Park said quietly. Better than you do, I think. Please, just give me 5 minutes to explain. There is nothing to explain, Mr. Choi said, not unkindly. We know everything we need to know. They moved toward the door with the efficient grace of men who'd made their decision and saw no reason to prolong discomfort. The translator scrambled to follow them, relief evident on her face at escaping this disaster. Mr. Choi paused at the threshold and looked back at me one more time. He said in Korean. They say Busan women are strong. Now I understand why. Then they were gone. The private dining room felt enormous in their absence. Too quiet. The ambient noise from the main restaurant filtered in, the clink of dishes, the murmur of other conversations, the sound of a world continuing normally while ours had just imploded. Bradley stood frozen beside the table, his hands braced against the back of his chair like it was the only thing keeping him upright. The servers appeared in the doorway, uncertain. One of them cleared his throat softly. Will you be staying for dessert? No, I said, standing smoothly, collecting my purse. We're finished here. Bradley finally looked at me. Really looked at me. And what he saw seemed to shock him more than anything that had happened in the last 20 minutes. "You destroyed me," he whispered. "You destroyed everything." I met his eyes and felt nothing but a strange, distant calm. "No, Bradley," I said quietly. "You destroyed it yourself." I just stopped pretending not to see. I walked out of Hanul table with my head high, my steps steady, leaving my husband standing alone in a room that still smelled like expensive wine and burnt bridges. Behind me, I heard him start to follow, then stop. The door closed between us with a soft, final click. Bradley caught up to me in the parking garage. His footsteps echoed against the concrete, sharp and fast. I kept walking toward our car, my heels clicking in steady rhythm. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. There was nothing left to run from. "Elena. Elena, stop." I stopped at the passenger door and turned to face him. His face was twisted with something between rage and disbelief. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, he looked older than his 39 years. Tired. Small. "Get in the car," he said, his voice tight. "We're going home. Now." I opened the door and slid into the passenger seat without a word. He got in beside me, started the engine, and pulled out of the garage too fast, tires squealing slightly against the smooth concrete. We made it 3 blocks before he exploded. What the actual hell was that? His hands gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. "Do you have any idea, any fucking idea, what you just did?" "I told the truth," I said calmly. "Something you should have done from the beginning." "The truth?" He laughed, sharp and bitter. "You humiliated me. In front of the biggest opportunity of my career, you humiliated me. You humiliated yourself, Bradley. Those numbers were inflated. The projections were unrealistic. They would have discovered it eventually. That's not the point." He swerved around a slower car, accelerating through a yellow light. "You don't undermine your husband in public. You don't, Christ, you don't even speak Korean." "Since when do you speak Korean?" "Since I was 2 years old," I said, my voice level. "I told you about it when we first started dating. You said it was interesting, and then changed the subject to your work." "I don't remember that." "I know." He was quiet for a moment, breathing hard. "Then, you did this on purpose. You've been planning this." "No," I said. "I've been existing. You just never noticed." "That's bullshit. This was calculated. You waited until the perfect moment to destroy me." I turned to look at him fully. "If I wanted to destroy you, Bradley, I would have done it years ago. I had every opportunity. Every inflated projection, every borrowed idea, every client pitch I wrote that you presented as your own. I could have exposed you 100 times. I didn't. Because I thought we were partners. We are partners." "No," I said quietly. "We never were. I was your assistant. Your prop. Your decoration." He flinched at the word. "I never called you that. You agreed when someone else did." The car went silent except for the hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. We pulled into our building's underground parking, and Bradley shut off the engine with more force than necessary. "We'll fix this," he said, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "We'll call them tomorrow. I'll apologize. You'll apologize. We'll explain that you were tired, that you misunderstood." "No. Elena. No, Bradley." I unbuckled my seatbelt and got out of the car. Inside our apartment, everything looked exactly as we'd left it. Perfectly decorated. Perfectly sterile. Perfectly not mine. I walked straight to the bedroom and pulled my suitcase from the closet. Bradley appeared in the doorway, watching me with an expression caught between confusion and condescension. "What are you doing?" "Packing." He laughed. Actually laughed. "You're being dramatic. Elena, come on. You're upset, I get it. But you're not leaving." Where would you even go? Anywhere that isn't here. I moved through the closet methodically, taking only what was truly mine. The clothes I'd bought myself, not the designer pieces Bradley had selected because they looked right for corporate events. The books I'd hidden away. The small wooden box my mother had given me that contained old photos from Busan. "This is ridiculous," Bradley said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being irrational. "You're throwing away 6 years of marriage over one argument?" "This isn't about one argument." I folded a sweater carefully, placed it in the suitcase. "This is about 6 years of disappearing." "Oh, 4, you're not disappearing. You're right here. You've always been right here." I stopped packing and turned to face him. "When's my birthday, Bradley?" He blinked. "What?" "My birthday." "When is it?" "Elena, this is childish. Just answer the question." He shifted his weight, annoyed. "It's in spring. April, I think." "July. July 23rd. "Okay, so I was off by a few months." "We've been busy." "What's my mother's name?" His jaw tightened. "I don't see what." "You don't know, do you?" My voice was still calm, but something was cracking beneath it. "You've met her a dozen times. She calls every Sunday. You don't know her name." "Sarah," he said, uncertain. "That's her American name." "What's her Korean name?" "The name she was born with." Silence. "What did I study in college?" "Business. Finance. Something like that. International Business and East Asian Studies. Summa cum laude." I zipped the suitcase closed. "Where did I work before we got married?" "Some consulting firm. Meridian Global. I was their youngest senior analyst. I turned down 3 Fortune 500 offers to support your career." I lifted the suitcase off the bed. "You don't know any of this because you never asked. You never cared to know." "That's not fair," Bradley said, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely hurt. "I love you. You love the idea of me," I said quietly. "The quiet wife. The pretty accessory. The woman who makes you look good at dinner parties. But you don't know me, Bradley. You never did." I walked past him toward the door. He caught my arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to stop me. "Elena, please. Don't do this. I'll do better. I'll learn Korean. I'll ask questions. We can fix this." I looked down at his hand on my arm, then up at his face. And I saw it clearly for the first time. He genuinely believed he could fix this with effort, with attention, with the same determination he applied to closing business deals. He thought this was a negotiation. "I don't want you to learn Korean for me," I said softly. "I wanted you to care that I already spoke it. 6 years ago. I wanted you to be curious about who I was before I became your wife. But you weren't. And now it's too late." I pulled my arm free gently. He didn't try to stop me again. "Where are you going?" he asked, and he sounded lost. Like a child who'd broken something without understanding how. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "But anywhere is better than being invisible." I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped into the hallway. "You'll regret this," Bradley called after me, his voice echoing. "You'll come back." I paused, looked back one last time at the apartment we'd shared. At the man I'd spent 6 years trying to fit myself around. "No," I said. "I really won't." The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. And for the first time in 6 years, I could breathe. I spent the first night in a hotel near the airport, one of those extended stay places with small kitchenettes and generic art on the walls. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No one had chosen the furniture. No one had decided which photos belonged on the nightstand. No one had told me it looked right. I sat on the bed with my phone in my hands, staring at the screen. 12 missed calls from Bradley. 7 voicemails I didn't listen to. 3 text messages that progressed from angry to apologetic to confused. I turned the phone off and slept for 11 hours straight. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the curtains, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, lightness. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. My phone buzzed the moment I turned it back on. But it wasn't Bradley. It was an unknown number with a Seoul country code. I stared at it for a moment, then answered. Mrs. Foster? The voice was familiar. Polite. Measured. This is David Choi. From Takahashi Industries. I hope I'm not calling too early. I glanced at the clock. 9:47 a.m. No, not at all. Mr. Choi. I'm surprised to hear from you. I imagine so. There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. I wanted to reach out personally. What happened last night was unusual. But not uninteresting. I closed my eyes. I apologize if I created an uncomfortable situation. You created an honest one, he corrected gently. That's different. And rare, in my experience. Another pause. I could hear ambient office noise in the background, phones ringing, voices in conversation. He was calling during business hours. This wasn't a courtesy call. Mrs. Foster, or should I say Ms. Kim? Elena is fine, I said quietly. Elena, then. His tone shifted, becoming more direct. Our firm is expanding our American operations. We need someone who understands both markets, not theoretically, but practically. Someone who sees risks before they become problems. Someone who speaks both languages, in every sense of the word. My heart started beating faster. We'd like to offer you a consulting position, Mr. Choi continued. Independent contractor status, initially. Competitive rate. Projects would involve market analysis, risk assessment, cultural bridge work between our Seoul headquarters and American partners. It would be remote for now, with quarterly travel to Korea if you're comfortable with that. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly unsteady. Why? I asked. You barely know me. I know enough, he said simply. I know you have the expertise we need. I know you value honesty over comfort. And I know, he paused, choosing his words carefully. I know what it looks like when someone has been underestimated for too long. I prefer not to make that mistake. My throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it. I'll have our legal team send over a formal offer by end of week. No pressure. But Elena? His voice softened slightly. People who speak truth in difficult moments are rare. Don't undervalue that. We ended the call with promises to discuss details later. I sat on the hotel bed, staring at my phone, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me in a way that was dizzying and terrifying and entirely necessary. 3 days later, the formal offer arrived. The compensation was more than I'd made at Meridian. The scope was challenging. The respect was present. Built into every clause, every term, every carefully worded responsibility. I signed it that afternoon. The divorce proceedings began 2 weeks later. Bradley tried to contest it at first. Send emails about counseling, about second chances, about how we'd built a life together. His lawyer sent formal letters about asset division, about the apartment, about the business interests I'd contributed to, informally. My lawyer, a sharp woman in her 50s who'd seen 1,000 cases like mine, looked at the documentation I'd kept over the years and smiled. You've been keeping records, she said. I worked in risk analysis, I replied. Documentation was habit. The settlement came through faster than Bradley wanted and slower than I needed. I got half of everything we'd accumulated, plus compensation for the intellectual property I'd contributed to foster capital, the algorithm, the market analyses, the client strategies that had been presented as his. I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted fair recognition for what I'd built. Through professional channels, I heard that Foster Capital had lost 2 other major prospects in the aftermath of the Takahashi dinner. Word traveled fast in international finance circles. Not because I'd said anything, I hadn't spoken to anyone about that night, but because Mr. Choi's firm had quietly declined to recommend Bradley's services to their partners. Reputation is everything in this industry. And Bradley's had developed cracks. I felt something about that. Not quite satisfaction. Not quite pity. Something more complex. He'd built his career on borrowed credibility, mine, and probably others before me. Eventually, that foundation was always going to crumble. I just happened to be there when it did. I found an apartment in a different neighborhood. Smaller than the place I'd shared with Bradley, but it had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced east and a tiny balcony where I could drink coffee in the mornings. I furnished it slowly. A couch I actually liked. Bookshelves I filled with Korean literature I'd kept hidden for years. Art that meant something to me instead of matching a designer's vision of sophistication. My mother flew in from California to help me move in. She walked through the apartment, touching things gently, the books, the photos I'd unpacked, the small Korean pottery I'd bought from a shop in Little 5 Points. She said softly in Korean, "This is your space." I replied, "Yes." She turned to me, her eyes bright. "You found yourself again." I hugged her and cried for the first time since leaving Bradley. Not sad tears. Release. 3 months after that dinner at Hanul table, I woke up in my own apartment, in my own bed, to sunlight streaming through curtains I'd chosen. My phone sat on the nightstand, no missed calls from Bradley anymore. He'd finally stopped trying. Instead, there was an email from Mr. Choi's office with a new project briefing. A calendar reminder for a video call with the Seoul team. A text from my mother asking if I wanted to visit her next month. I got up, made coffee in my small kitchen, and stood on my balcony watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, Bradley was probably already at his office, trying to rebuild what he'd lost. Somewhere out there, other women were disappearing into marriages that made them smaller. But I wasn't one of them anymore. I was Elena Kim again. Not Kim Foster. Not Foster. Just Kim. The name I was born with. The name that meant gold in Korean. The name that had always been mine. I took a sip of coffee and smiled at nothing in particular. For the first time in 6 years, the future felt wide open. And I was ready. 6 months after that dinner at Hanul table, I sat in a conference room in Seoul, presenting market risk analysis to a room full of executives who leaned forward to hear every word. I spoke in Korean when addressing the Seoul team, switched to English for the American partners joining via video call, and moved between both languages so fluidly that I barely noticed when I made the transition. This was who I'd always been, someone who belonged to multiple worlds, who could translate not just words but context, culture, understanding. Someone who'd forgotten that for 6 years. When the presentation ended, Mr. Choi caught my eye across the table and nodded once. Approval. Respect. The kind of recognition that doesn't need to be spoken. After the meeting, as I packed up my materials, one of the younger analysts approached me, a woman in her late 20s with sharp eyes and a careful smile. "Ms. Kim," she said in English. "I just wanted to say, that was brilliant. The way you caught that regulatory overlap that everyone else missed." "Thank you," I said. "It's all about knowing what questions to ask." She hesitated, then added quietly, "My boyfriend keeps telling me I should quit my job. He says it's too stressful, that I should focus on supporting his career instead." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "I don't know. Maybe he's right." I looked at her for a long moment. Saw myself at 28. Saw the beginning of a slow disappearance. "Can I tell you something?" I said gently. "The moment you make yourself smaller to fit someone else's dream, you start forgetting your own shape. And it's very hard to remember it again." Her eyes widened slightly. "If he loved you," I continued, "he'd want you to be brilliant. Not comfortable. Not convenient. Brilliant." Anyone who asks you to shrink isn't afraid you'll fail. They're afraid you'll succeed. She nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression. Thank you, she whispered. I watched her walk away and hoped she'd remember that conversation someday when she needed it. That evening, I had dinner with Mr. Choi and several other senior executives at a restaurant overlooking the Han River. The conversation flowed easily, business and personal, English and Korean, the kind of multi-layered dialogue I'd missed without realizing how much. You've adapted well, Mr. Park said, pouring me more tea. Some people find the transition between corporate cultures difficult. I've had practice, I said. I spent most of my life translating between worlds. I just forgot, for a while, that I was good at it. Your ex-husband, Mr. Choi said carefully, not quite a question. I heard his firm has downsized. I'd heard that too. Foster Capital had lost 3 more major clients. Bradley had been forced to lay off his small team. The last I'd heard, he was trying to pivot into smaller, domestic consulting work. I don't take pleasure in that, I said honestly. I just wanted the truth to matter. The truth always matters, Mr. Choi replied. Some people just learn that lesson more expensively than others. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching lights reflect off the river below. May I ask you something? Mr. Park said. That night at the restaurant, had you planned what you were going to do? I thought about it. About sitting at that table, listening to men discuss me like I was furniture. About Bradley's careless agreement. About the moment I'd set down my chopsticks and decided I was done disappearing. No, I said. I'd spent 6 years planning to stay quiet. That night, I just stopped. Sometimes, Mr. Choi said thoughtfully, the most powerful thing you can do is stop pretending. Late that night, alone in my hotel room, I opened my laptop and wrote an email I'd been composing in my head for months. Dear Bradley. I'm not writing this because I need closure. I have that already. I'm writing because there are things I should have said years ago, and I think maybe you need to hear them now. You didn't make me disappear. I did that myself. Every time I swallowed a correction, every time I let you present my work as yours, every time I chose silence over conflict, those were my choices. I can't blame you for not seeing me when I was actively trying to be invisible. But here's what I learned. Invisibility feels safe until you realize you've disappeared even to yourself. You asked me once if I regretted leaving. The truth is, I regret staying as long as I did. I regret all the years I spent believing that making myself smaller was the same as being supportive. I regret teaching you that my silence meant agreement instead of erasure. I don't hate you, Bradley. I think you loved me the best way you knew how. You just loved the version of me that was convenient, that fit neatly into your life without requiring too much space or attention or recognition. And I let you. But I'm done letting anyone mistake my quiet for weakness. I'm done translating myself into something more digestible. I'm done being decoration. I hope you find someone who challenges you, who takes up space, who refuses to shrink. And I hope, when you do, you have the courage to love all of her, not just the parts that make you comfortable. Take care of yourself. Elena. I read it 3 times, then deleted it without sending. He didn't need to hear it. I just needed to write it. Some conversations are meant to be had only with yourself. People ask me sometimes what I would have done differently. If I could go back to that first year of marriage, knowing what I know now, would I have spoken up sooner? Would I have refused to quit my job? Would I have corrected him the first time he presented my work as his own? I don't know. Maybe I needed those 6 years. Maybe I needed to disappear completely to understand how much space I actually required. Maybe some lessons can only be learned by living through them. What I do know is this: silence isn't the absence of power. Sometimes it's observation. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's fluency in a language someone else doesn't even know you speak. The danger isn't in being quiet. The danger is in forgetting that you have a voice at all. Bradley thought my silence meant ignorance. He thought language was power. He thought I was decoration, something beautiful but inert, present but irrelevant, seen but not heard. He was wrong about all of it. Because I wasn't silent. I was listening. I was understanding. I was seeing everything. And the moment I decided to speak, everything changed. So let me ask you something. What would you do if someone mistook your quiet for weakness? What would you do if you realized you'd been disappearing, slowly, carefully, one compromise at a time, into someone else's version of who you should be? Would you stay silent? Or would you remember that silence is only powerful when it's a choice, not a cage? I spent 6 years being decoration. Being convenient. Being small. And then, in one dinner, in one moment of clarity, I remembered. I was never silent. I was always listening. I just forgot that listening is only the first half of a conversation. The second half? That's when you speak. And trust me, when you finally do, when you stop shrinking and start taking up the space you've always deserved, the whole world shifts. Not because you've changed, but because you've stopped pretending to be anything other than exactly who you are. That night at Hanul table, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Because the truth, spoken clearly in a language they didn't think I knew, was louder than any shout could ever be. He thought I didn't understand Korean. He thought I didn't understand business. He thought I didn't understand my own worth. He was wrong. And everything changed. Thanks for listening. If this story resonated with you, please, kindly drop a comment, like, share, and also subscribe. See you in the next video.